Am I in the water?
No, that's recording him.
Yeah, if it's just pointing this way. I can switch the camera around if you want to be the center of attention for the video.
That's the fear of my life.
I don't like it either.
So we are in the book of Judges tonight. Tell you what, I'm going to open it up a little bit different. Can you guys tell me what has happened in the book or books preceding up to Judges? What is the setting for the book of Judges? And what do you guys think that the book of Judges is about? Not everybody at once before I start calling names.
They've been disobedient.
Been disobedient? Yep. So,
Now, is this where they wanted?
They wanted kings
They
later.
wanted.
so that'll come
Yeah.
2 weeks from now when we get into Samuel.
Okay.
But God set up this system in Judges, I do believe.
Yeah.
But the disobedience, that is a common theme that we're going to see all throughout the book.
Joshua gave him a commandment, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And that didn't last too long.
Lasted right up about till the day Joshua died. So, yeah, you pretty much get the gist.
It keeps saying that they did evil in the sight
They did
of the
evil in the
Lord.
sight of the Lord. Yes, it is a very tired theme by the time you get to the end of the book. But really, the whole purpose of the book, or really the main point of the book, can really be summed up. Go to the very last verse in the book of Judges. So that would be Judges 21, verse 25. And whoever gets it first, go ahead and just read it.
In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah, so that is really the whole point of the book of Judges is to show the failure or the lack thereof of any kind of leadership for the children of Israel. So,
Can I read this note on that verse?
yeah, absolutely.
During the time of the Judges, the people of Israel experienced trouble because they acted on their own opinions of what was right and wrong. That sounds familiar. This produced horrendous results. Today, our world is similar. Individuals, groups, and societies have made themselves the final authority without reference to God. When people selfishly satisfy their personal desires at any cost, everyone pays the price. That sounds familiar.
Absolutely.
Sounds like today in situational ethics.
Yeah. There's a lot, unfortunately, there's a lot of parallels that we can take from the book of Judges to America today. So the book opens up in chapter 1. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight them?" The Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand." And Judah said to Simeon and his brother, "Come with me up into the territory allotted to me, and we may fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go with you into the territory allotted you." So Simeon went with them. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites in their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. So starting out the book, it seems like after the death of Joshua, they're just taking everything in stride, and it feels like a continuation of the conquest, doesn't it? It feels like they picked up right where Joshua left off, and they have this great head of steam as they continue to conquer the land. But then that is going to come to a screeching halt. So in the second half of chapter 1, let's just go ahead and read that as a group. So chapter 1, starting in verse 27, And we're going to read, you know what? Let's read
Where are you at?
Judges chapter
I'm in
1.
Joshua. No wonder. Okay.
All right, everybody in the right book? Book of Judges, chapter 1, first page, maybe the second page for you. Starting in verse 27, that's where we'll start, and we'll go to the end of the chapter there. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. We get a lot of good place names there, don't we?
When Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely.
29. In Judges. We're in Judges. Yeah, I did the same thing.
So Ed was peeking at Mary. That's why he's in the wrong spot.
Judges 1.
Mary, you can go ahead and read 29 there.
Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, so the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them.
Neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites living Kibron or Nahor, who remained among them, but they did subject to them than to force labor.
Nor did Asher drive out those living in Akko, or Sidon, or Alab, or Akzib, or Helba, or Aphek, or Rehob.
I heard Rehob is great this time of year. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Ed, do you want to pick up verse 33 for us?
33. Neither did Shemesh or Beth Anath, but the Naphtalites too lived among the Canaanites, inhabitants of the land, and those living in Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced laborers for them.
And the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley.
And the Amorites were determined also to hold out in Mount Heres, Jabalon, and Shalbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph increased, they too were pressed in forced labor.
The boundary of the Amorites was from Scorpion Pass to Selah and beyond.
So I'm going to try to find one of our maps that we had printed off for the weeks prior. So I know that seemed a little bit redundant, but there was a common theme there. Did you guys catch it? So they would fail to drive them out of the land and then drive them out of the land completely. But what did they do?
Forced labor.
Made them slaves. So this actually started. I had a better map. I don't know where it went. But anyways, this actually started back in Joshua. So this is really an echo of Joshua's failure that we didn't really go over last week. But chapter 2 starts out saying, Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And listen to this part. Verse 2, And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this that you have done? So, Mike, can you go to Deuteronomy chapter 7? Because that's when God lays down this rule. Deuteronomy 7, and I don't know. Joshua chapter 9 is the other place. I'll just give you the summary of Joshua chapter 9 after Mike reads.
Deuteronomy, where?
Deuteronomy 7, verse 2.
Okay. Well, it looks like that's a continuation of a sentence here, so I'm going to start with verse 1.
Sure.
When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy.
Yeah, so what was God's command when they were to eventually enter the land? What were they supposed to do with the inhabitants there? Kill them to a man, each and every one. So that might seem a little bit shocking to our modern sensibilities. I know we talked about this when we were talking about the conquest of Canaan, how God was using Israel as a means of judgment. If you were actually to go in and look at what was going on inside of Canaan at this point in time, we see a lot of discussions of like the giants in the land. A lot of folks believe that the giants were a product of demonic activity. So any man who was left alive, anybody who was left alive in the land was just leaving a foothold for more demonic activity, like nothing like we would ever experience in our lives. But at that point in time, that was, I don't know if normal is the right word, but that was something that was around. I remember the discussion of giants in Genesis chapter 6, where sons of Adam, or the sons of God came in to the women, got them pregnant, demonic activity, giants were born from it. It was a whole big thing, big people too. But there was a remnant of that going on in Canaan. So God's instructions were very clear to kill everybody to a man, don't leave anybody alive, and don't make any covenants with them. What's the importance of not making a covenant with these people?
How much something they have to keep with them, and they weren't supposed to do that.
And with a covenant, there's some give and take, so they might have to give up some of what they believe or some of their morals to go into that covenant.
Yep. So they became subject to a covenant with wicked men and were not able to fulfill the covenant that they made with God as a result of it. So it was a big deal. And all of this started with Joshua and the Gibeonites in Joshua chapter 9. So I did find my map. I don't know if any of the printouts are still floating around here. But essentially you can see where all the territories are, where everybody's territory was supposed to be in the land. So back in Joshua, and I'm only going to stay here briefly, is they were conquering the land. They were making great strides. They get about to the middle of the country there. And then these folks, the Gibeonites, come, deceive Joshua into making a deal that they would let them stay in the land and they would be their servants. They would be their slaves. But God told them, no, you're supposed to kill them all. Joshua didn't consult with God on the matter before he made the covenant, and it came to bite them. And all of a sudden, they were having a successful conquest that gets stalled in the dead center of the country. So the country is divided at that point in time between north and south. They can conquer the north, they can conquer the south, but in Gibeon, or where the Gibeonites are from, you can't do nothing. You can make them forced laborers, which I believe God would later use them to be forced laborers to get timber to build the temple. Don't quote me on that. I'll fact check myself before we get to the temple. So that brings us back to Judges chapter 2. And this became a common practice, was that Whenever they would fail to drive somebody out of the land completely, they would overpower them enough to turn them into slaves. But all of a sudden, you have all of this worldly influence that is going to affect the people of Israel. And we see the consequences of that time and time and time again. So the end of chapter 2, starting verse 16, says, Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of those who plundered them, yet they did not listen to the judges, for they whored around with other gods and bowed down to them. Soon they turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, Because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did, or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Really, that's a summary of the entire book. We're going to see this same story. It's amazing the repetition that's in the book of Judges, and they just don't get it. So one of the printouts that you guys have here is the cycle, the sin cycle in the book of Judges. And what I can appreciate about the sin cycle is I'm sure you have witnessed people in your life who have been caught in this cycle. I'm sure there are times in your life when you have been caught in this cycle. So, starts out at the very top there, saying, where does the sin cycle start? Mary at the top.
Israel disobeys God.
Israel disobeys God. Then what happens next, Mike?
Israel is oppressed by enemies.
So they sin, then they have to face the consequences of those sins. After oppression, what happens there, Ed?
Response, Israel cries out to God.
And so finally, when they're facing the consequences of their actions, that's when they turn back, they repent of their ways and say, God, okay, we need help. So God is faithful to his promises. So what happens after repentance there in the cycle, Jim?
I'm not sure which is more, but Israel experiences a time of peace. You were the one before that.
Yeah, the one before that. That's, you got us to the end point. So,
God raises up a judge to deliver Israel.
yeah, so God will, they start to sin. They get oppressed as a consequence of their actions. They finally learn their lesson. They cry out to the Lord for help. God delivers them through a judge, and then they have peace until the judge dies. But what happens after the judge dies? They jump right back into it again. So we're only going to look at a couple of the judges tonight, just for sake of time. So you guys have, where'd it go? Oh, it's on the back of this page. So you guys have a full list of all the judges in the book of Judges. If you guys want to take that home to study it a little bit, I want to look at the very first judge on the list. So the only reason I'm picking out this judge specifically is because it's a nice summarized version of the story. So let's all go to Judges chapter 3. I don't see any pages turning, so you guys must have already been there. So Judges 3, starting in verse 7, and we only need to go from 7 to 11. So, Mary, do you want to start out with 7?
So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Ashtaroth.
The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan, Rathaim, king of Aram, and Naraphaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years.
And when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them.
The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan Rishathaim.
So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel,
Yep.
son of Kenaz, died.
All right, so where's my little circle? I think it almost lines up verse for verse between the story of Othniel and the cycle, the sin cycle. So on your sheet there, if you've got a pen, if you just want to write Judges 3, 7 to 11. And you don't have to. This is just if you guys want a nice summarized version. And you could literally just go around the circle. Sin is verse 7, oppression verse 8, repentance verse 9, deliverance verse 10, peace verse 11. So it is it's a beautiful summary of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So the book of Judges actually lasts for about 300 years from start to finish. And you can see Othniel is actually a relative of somebody we know from previous books of the Bible. Who is Othniel related to?
The other spine.
Yep. Which other spy? Caleb. Yep. So he's Caleb's nephew. But you'll see as we progress through the story of the book of Judges, the sin really seems to grow and grow and grow the further they're separated from the generation that served the Lord, until it finally comes to a crescendo at the end of the book in chapters 19, 20, and 21, with the tribe of Benjamin doing some absolutely heinous things. And a story that is parallel to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's wild. When you read the story, it reads almost word for word the way that you would read Genesis 19 when you're reading about Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's God's own people acting in that capacity. Okay. So we have several fun stories here of assassination. Ehud is a good one. With Ehud, a fat man is stabbed in the belly when he's on the toilet, and his servants don't want to go in because he's on the toilet, and they think he's just having a rough time there. So the assassin gets to escape. The story of Deborah and Barak. A lady drives a tent peg through a man's head in assassination. Now, that's not the point of the stories. That's just the interesting points that'll help you remember them. There's a lot more to the stories than just that. The story of Deborah is a great contrast between Deborah and the enemy king, because Deborah is really, it's a great story of women getting involved in the scriptures in a capacity that God has truly called them to. It's a great rallying cry. It's not a new feminist rallying cry or anything like that. This is just women being obedient to God and God blessing them for it, and God doing great things through these women. Okay. So after Deborah, we get to Gideon. Now that should be a name. Sounds at least familiar to everybody. So I'll ask the group again. What can you guys tell me about Gideon? Don't be shy.
He was out grinding wheat, and he was using something stupid, all he had to grind this wheat, because they were so overwhelmed by the enemy. I think it was something like a cider press or something.
Very close.
Grind this wheat, and he was hid, so nobody would see him and tell on him. And an angel appeared to him and said, "Gideon, mighty man of valor," and in American language he said, "Who me? I'm scared to death."
Yep, so the story of Gideon starts out with him threshing on the wine press floor. So the wine press would have been down in the ground. He's hiding himself away, threshing this wheat, hiding from the enemy, and the angel of the Lord appears to him and calls him a mighty man of valor. So we do get to see, like with the story of Deborah, we do get to see the contrast of who the person is versus who God intends them to be. So Gideon was looking at himself thinking, I'm just weak little scared Gideon here hiding on the wine press floor. But God knew he was going to use Gideon for a great purpose. It's great that the Lord looks at us as to who he's going to make us and not who we are today. Amen?
I'd encourage everybody to read that story of Gideon, because it is something else. How many men turned out to help him, and then God cut that number in half, cut it in half again. He finally wound up with 300. And then to hear how God won that battle through 300 men. It's really a great story.
It is. And you gave a pretty good summary there. So God calls Gideon. Gideon was really a nobody at this point in time. So what God tells him to do to really make a name for himself, to make Gideon somebody notable, is he tells him to go into town and destroy the altar of Baal. So he does. And because even Gideon's family was getting involved with things they shouldn't have been getting involved with.
Didn't he kill his daddy's prize bull?
Yep. So
It's a story.
it is. It's quite the story. And I want to hit up Gideon a little bit. I want to hit up Samson a little bit, and then the Benjamites. So I don't know how much detail we'll be able to get into today, but he calls Gideon to do something that's just, to us, and excuse my language when I say this, God calls Gideon to do something that we would think is wildly stupid. And that's the theme of the story, is doing things that are wildly stupid, but doing them with the Lord. So God knows what he's doing. It reminds me of the verse that says God's ways confound the wise. So now I do appreciate what Gideon's father says after this happens, because his dad was really in his corner. And you wouldn't necessarily expect that after what the Lord called Gideon to do. So in Judges chapter 6, after Gideon destroys the altar of Baal, we'll pick up in verse 28. I'll read it if you guys want to follow along. When the men of the town rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down, and the second bull was offered on the altar, and the second bull was offered on the altar that had been built. They said to one another, "Who has done this thing?" And after they searched and inquired, they said, "Gideon, the son of Joash, has done this thing." So the men of the town said to Joash, "Bring out your son, that he may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down. Therefore, on that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, that is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he broke down his altar. So what was the consequences of Gideon being faithful to the Lord? Well, his father's got his back. Baal worship is starting to come to an end, and it's really a rallying point for the children of Israel to stand against Baal and Baal worship. So his dad comes in and says, look, if Baal's a god, let him take care of his own altar. It's a lot of parallels to Elijah and the prophets of Baal, where Elijah gives a challenge to the prophets. They build 2 altars. One of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. They build 2 altars. The prophets of Baal, or he says to the prophets of Baal, call on to Baal, and I'll call on to God. Whichever God answers is the God we know is true. So, prophets of Baal call on Baal day and night. They beat themselves, whip themselves, trying to get Baal's attention. Elijah starts mocking them, which is great. And then finally, Elijah ups the ante a little bit when it's his turn. He says, all right, go and get 12 jugs of water, pour it on the bull. Go get 12 more, pour it on the bull. So the altar's soaked. The ditch around the altar's full of water. He calls on the Lord. Fire rains down, and the people know without a doubt who is God. That has nothing to do with tonight's lesson. It's just one of my favorite stories.
I love that one too.
So, then there's the second part of the story of Gideon, which is the signs of the fleeces. Does anybody know? This is all Sunday school stuff. You guys, you're well versed in the Lord. What was the story of Gideon and the fleeces?
About the dew.
About the dew? He was testing God, wasn't he? So he didn't want to trust what the Lord told him. So he set up a challenge for God. And because of God's grace, he entertained that challenge. So initially,
Did it twice, though.
he did. The audacity of Gideon to test God twice. So initially he said that if God, what you're saying is true, I'm going to lay this fleece out. In the morning, if the ground's dry and the fleece is wet, I'll know it was you. Sure enough, the ground was dry, the fleece was wet. That wasn't good enough for Gideon. So he has to go out a second night and say, all right, Lord, this time I want you to make the ground wet and the fleece dry. God listens to his challenge. He entertains the challenge. Gideon knows that what he's been told is true, but then God kind of flips the script on him, doesn't he? So Gideon went to go challenge God a couple of times. God's going to challenge Gideon a couple of times to test Gideon's faithfulness to him.
Mike's still there sitting there. He tried to fleece God.
I don't have a pen to write that down. Maybe that's where I came from.
So what God does is Gideon actually has a pretty respectable turnout. Some 32,000 men that show up, and God slowly whittles away that army. He says, first and foremost, if you're scared, go home. Good chunk of the men go home scared. And then he whittles and whittles and whittles, and finally gets to a challenge that is unique in a way. A challenge that I've heard many different preachers and Bible teachers theorize on the point of the challenge. I don't know if we're ever meant to know exactly why God set this challenge, other than to whittle down the army to a mere 300 men. So, what was the final challenge? I'll let you tell us what that last challenge was to whittle down the army.
Well, the last one,
Yeah.
I believe it was how they drank out of the stream.
Yep. Told them to go down to the creek and take a drink of water.
Who bent clear down and drank, and then there was some that drank this way. That determined.
Yeah. So the ones who bent down on all fours and just sucked the water right up out of the creek, he told those guys to go home. But the ones who took it up in their hands and brought the water up to their mouths, those were the men who could stay. And the grand total of those who could stay was 300 men. So Gideon challenged God a couple of times to make sure God was true. God challenged Gideon a couple of times to make sure he was true. So he has to go into battle with only 300 men. And what the crazy part is that when they go into battle, none of them are carrying swords. They carry torches and trumpets, and God wins the day for them.
Had to put the fire in the jar.
Yep. So they cause a commotion on the outside of camp, and that's enough to scare the enemy, and the enemy ends up all killing each other. It's a great showing of the Lord.
Stationed out. See, some here, some there, some there. I tell you guys, it's a great story.
It is.
I love it.
So that's where the Gideon symbol comes from, the fire in the jar.
Probably
there's that.
so. Probably
I
so.
should have had our resident Gideon tell this story.
So they would yell, they would break the jar, there's the fire and the yell, and the other guys was terrified. Yeah, that was the end of it.
Yeah.
Disperse. And that's what our troubles do, they disperse.
Yep, they take care of themselves when we trust in the Lord, don't they? The story of Gideon's a great story. We spent 15 minutes on it already, so we should probably move on. Like I said, we're not going to go through all the judges because it is it's the same story over and over again. Same story, different characters.
And the same God. Every time, the same God.
And it really makes you wonder how God could be so patient with them as a people.
It makes me too excited when I talk to you.
No, it's a great.
Not too much, Ellen. We appreciate your input.
You're the only one who's talking tonight, so keep talking.
I know it.
The rest of us don't have to talk.
So you've got the list of the judges there. I want to talk about Samson for a little bit. So I'm sure whenever you hear preachers go into the book of Judges, it's been to talk about either Gideon or Samson. They're certainly the two most notable judges in the book. They get the most screen time, if you will, out of all of the judges. The one thing that I really want to highlight, because I think we could probably do the same thing for Samson that we did for Gideon and go through the entire story. But the one thing I want to highlight about Samson is that Samson wasn't a good guy, was he? He was vindictive. He was selfish. He was arrogant and proud. Yet he was the one that God used to deliver the Israelites. He was the one that God used to punish the Canaanites. So he's a good summary of what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. It's hard being 4.
Yeah.
But
Our granddaughter said that one time, oh, it's so hard to be 9.
I'll be finding out if it's hard to be 29. Hopefully it's easier than 28. But so Samson is a good case study on the idea of God using the unrighteous to bring judgment and punishment to others who are unrighteous. Because Samson really, his whole life is just a calamity of bad decisions. So you've got the printout there. We don't again, we're not going to go through the entire story, but you can read through the summary there. We will read about the birth of Samson, though. So go to Judges chapter 13. So Judges chapter 13, and Mike, would you go to Numbers chapter 6? So I just want to bring this up for continuity's sake. Mary, do you want to read chapter 13, verse 5?
Chapter 6, you see in Numbers?
Yep.
For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head. For the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines.
So, do you guys remember talking about the Nazarite vow? And what is the origin of the Nazarite vow? Well, I already gave you the origin. It's in Numbers chapter 6. I gave away the answer too soon. But Mike, do you want to read verses 2 and 3?
Sure. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of dedication to the Lord as a Nazarite, they must abstain from wine and other fermented drink, and must not drink vinegar made from wine or other fermented drink. They must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins."
So, to make the Nazarite vow, you really had to distinguish yourself from the people, even from your own countrymen, because it required such a dedication to the Lord. Yeah, there was a prohibition on alcohol, but it went so far as to say you can't even touch a grape. Yeah, you can't eat those sun-dried raisins.
Yeah.
Now, you can't eat your raisin bread.
Verse 4 says, as long as they remain under their Nazarite vow, they must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or skins.
And if you took the Nazarite vow, you couldn't touch a carcass. You couldn't touch a dead body. There was a lot that went into the Nazarite vow. And we see a couple of people take the Nazarite vow throughout the scriptures. And Samson's probably the most notable. Samson, because we all know his long hair that he had and his poor choice in girlfriends with Delilah. But so Samson was really a son of promise. So the angel of the Lord came to Samson's mom and dad, and they were infertile at the time, weren't able to have kids. And it amazes me how often this theme comes up when God's about to bring a deliverer or to bring a child of promise. It's to somebody who's barren. You see it with all the patriarchs. You see it with Samson's mother. You see it with Hannah. You see it with Sarah. Yep. You see it with Elizabeth. So time and time again, this is a miracle that God does. And it really should make us appreciate what the miracle of childbirth actually is.
And it sounds like the Nazarite vow was just a temporary thing. It wasn't a lifelong thing from what I'm reading.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yep. So typically when they would take the Nazarite vow, it would just be for a period of time. But for Samson, it was supposed to be from the time of the womb. So it was supposed to be much more permanent than the Nazarite vow typically was. That's what made Samson special, or was supposed to make Samson special. So what was one of the rules that God gave the children of Israel concerning marriage? Or let me bring it back to where we started our discussion tonight. What is marriage in its rawest form? To become one? Is that all you were going to say, Mary?
Well, Man and woman.
Man and woman, yes, yep. We're making that assumption. I trust the group here to know that. Is it a covenant?
Yeah, I was gonna say it's a covenant, it's not a contract.
It's not a contract. It's a covenant. So, who were the Israelites told not to make covenants with? Philistines. You're reading ahead. Who did Samson want to make this covenant with? A Philistine woman, because he thought she was good looking. And it didn't matter what anybody said. He was going to follow his heart. He was going to follow his eyes and his lust and cause all sorts of problems. So the story starts out bad and it just gets worse from there. He abandons his wife for a time, she goes back to live with her father. He goes back to the father and he says, no, you abandoned her. You're not going to go in just to have relations with her. You're not going to use her like that. So what does Samson do? He ties torches to the tails of foxes and sets them loose in the grain fields and burns up the entire town's food supply. And then he goes and tells the town the reason this happened was because of my wife and her dad. So they go and they kill his wife and her dad. That's how bad of a guy Samson was. Not a good guy. And the decisions are just as bad all throughout the story until you get to the very end of the story. So God makes Samson pay for his lack of obedience. When Samson is with Delilah, and Delilah cuts his hair, the cutting of the hair was the cutting of the symbol of the contract. So the Nazirite vow that he made with God was broken. It is not that God was untrue to his word. Samson voluntarily left the contract by making bad choices and having Delilah cut his hair. Delilah tried to have him killed 2 times before, and he didn't learn his lesson. So this is all on Samson. You can't blame God for being true to his word. If God says that if you do this, then I will abandon you, and you do that, guess what? The Lord's going to abandon you. So finally he's captured, and we all know the great end of the story where he's blinded. He is being mocked in front of a crowd of 3,000. He grabs the pillars and he asks God, all right, he finally seems to have a little bit of humility, and the story ends in Judges 16:28 says, and Samson called unto the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And so he takes down the pillars, drops everybody who's sitting on the roof, kills them all, 3,000 dead. Samson avenges his eyes, and God uses Samson, a very broken man, to bring judgment upon the Philistines. But while Samson was a judge, he did have, he used Samson to bring peace to Israel. So just because the Lord is using somebody, you could probably apply this into a lot of walks of life. Just because the Lord is using somebody does not mean that that person is necessarily in right standing with the Lord at that point in time. God can use the wicked to fulfill his purposes. Any questions, comments, life stories, life lessons on that note?
I think he was very, very humble. Big, strong Samson had to ask a little boy to lead him to those pillars.
Yep.
And boy, the male ego, that must have been crushed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, and this is a little bit off topic, but kind of not. I feel like pride is one of the hardest sins to address in the church. Because in a lot of ways, pride is viewed as a virtue in the world, isn't it? If a man doesn't have any pride, that's a bad thing. But we as Christians should really be cautious about the pride in our own lives, because it can cause a lot more problems than if you're proud, you'd be willing to admit.
There are two different kinds of pride.
Yeah, I think that there is. The Apostle Paul showed a fatherly pride, which is certainly different. So what the trap that we fall into, and I'll leave this up to the group for discussion, is the trap that we fall into is there's some gray area as well. If when I go to work, they've got pretty strict dress codes where I work. I've gotten yelled at because some of my shirts, all my collared shirts have plastic collar stays that keep the collars nice and straight. Well, the collar stays have fallen out of some of my shirts, and they're one of the managers at my job, every time I wear a shirt without collar stays, he makes a comment to me. So it is good to want to have a nice ironed shirt, want to make sure you're not all wrinkly. There's nothing wrong with having pride in your cleanliness, right? But what if I go out to Men's Warehouse, or I go to some fancy tailor, and I always have to have the nicest dress shirts, the nicest suits. I can't have a single wrinkle. It's got to be dry cleaned every time I wear it. Would you say that would be a man of pride in a bad sense? Is your pride a problem at that point in time? Yeah, but where's the line? So when I say that pride is difficult to call out in the church, I mean because an action that somebody might do without pride, without sinful pride, another man could do that same action because of the wrong reasons. Pride is a lot about intent, and it is so hard to discern the intent of somebody. And it's not something you should go around trying to discern or judge willy-nilly.
I think your boss wants you to remember who you represent.
Yep.
A good company.
Yep.
Good man.
When I am working for Crown Equipment, I'm going to have that guy who works for Bowl Equipment in Marion. He's going to have a polo shirt, but when I walk in, they just allowed us to stop wearing ties a couple of months ago. But when the Crown guy would walk in, you knew that they worked for Crown because they were the best dressed guy in the room. That's what they want. Now, I always thought the ties were uncomfortable, and don't tell them, but I didn't wear the ties when I was out in the field most of the time. But there is nothing wrong with wanting to have a clean appearance. But if that is your highest virtue in life, then that's a problem.
When I first taught, they had a pretty strict dress code. You had to wear a shirt and tie and sport coat. And now they have dress down Friday.
Mm-hmm.
And they come in all sloppy or whatever.
Yeah, their dress-up days are nothing compared to your dress-up days.
Yeah, times are changing for sure when it comes to dress. But we got to move on. So chapter 17 is about a man named Micah and a Levite. I'm not going to talk about that one tonight. I think I'm actually going to preach on that one here 2 weeks from now. So the tribe of Dan, if you remember from the very first chapter, the tribe of Dan was given a section of property that was promised to them, but they weren't able to conquer it because of their lack of faithfulness. So they ended up settling elsewhere in the land. A lot of problems with the Danites, but finally we get to the last 3 chapters, and it's another Levite causing problems with his concubine. So what I want to highlight here, and go to chapter 19, and we'll finish off with this story. Great story to finish off on. So, Mike, I'm going to make you the gopher guy again. Go back to Genesis chapter 19. So, rest of us will be in Judges 19. But Mike's going to go back to Genesis
I'm always
19.
behind everybody else.
You are. That's why I put you where you're comfortable. Okay, so I want to make sure. So essentially, this Levite goes into Gibeah. He's hanging out in the town square. It was customary in that day if you saw a sojourner, you saw a visitor, you saw somebody who wasn't from an out-of-towner, and you saw them in the town square, it would be customary for you to invite them into your home to provide a lodging for them, to give them a place to stay. This was a very important thing to do. Why? Because the Israelites were sojourners for generations and generations. So God wanted them to reciprocate that with sojourners in their own towns. But so this Levite's in Gibeah. He's in the town square. The sun's starting to go down, and nobody's invited him to stay. He's thinking, okay, I'm going to have to spend the night in the square. And then an old man comes and says, all right, look, I'll take care of you. I just want to make sure you don't spend the night in the square. It's too dangerous out in the square. So that's where we're going to pick up. And Judges 19. And I'll start in verse 22. And then we'll go around the room until 26. So the Bible says, as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house that we may know him. And to know somebody biblically, in a biblical sense, is not the way that you and I would say that we know somebody.
This words it quite plainly to your house so that we can have sex with them.
Yeah.
Mine says carnal.
Yep. So Ed, verse 23.
The owner of the house went inside and said to them, no, my friends, no, be so vile, since the man is the guest. Don't do this disgraceful thing.
Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now. Humble them and do with them as you please, but to this man do not do such a vile thing.
But the men listened to him, so the man took his concubine and sent her outside to him, and they raped her and abused her throughout the night. And at dawn, they let her go.
At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight.
It's a terrible, awful story. But that story does remind you of another story, doesn't it? Or it should. So, let me make sure I've got the right one.
Chapter 19, starting with verse 1.
Yeah.
And how far?
Go to verse 11. It's a lot, but it'll give us the whole story.
The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. My lords, he said, please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and go on your way early in the morning. No, they answered, we will spend the night in the square. But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them. Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. Get out of the way, they replied. This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. He'll treat you worse than them. They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness, so that they could not find the door.
Does that story sound familiar? That is the exact same story that we just read. What happened in Sodom is the exact same thing that happened in Gibeon. So when I say that this is the crescendo of the wickedness of the children of Israel in the book of Judges, this is what I mean. They have reverted back to being like Sodom and like Gomorrah. God's chosen people just a few generations before they served God in the wilderness, but they were so far removed from the Lord at this point in time that they were acting just like the folks in Sodom. There's no way that wasn't purposeful when God had his hand in writing these stories. There is supposed to be a parallel. A man who is about to stay, a sojourner, an out-of-towner who's going to stay the night in the square, an old man pulls him into his house, group outside tries to rape him, the man offers up his virgin daughters. It's wild, the closeness, how similar these stories are. Except that's not even the end. The Gibeonites were even worse, where the men were turned away blind in Genesis. The men here in Judges were given some of what they wanted. They were given the concubine, and they raped her all night. They raped her to death. So what the Levite does is he throws his concubine's raped, murdered, dead body on the back of his donkey, takes her home, and this is a very shocking story, takes her home, cuts her body into 12 pieces, and sends it out to the 12 tribes to say this is how wicked Israel has become. And that's how the book of Judges ends, with Israel going to war against Benjamin, trying to bring judgment. The same way that they brought judgment to the Canaanites, now they have to bring that judgment upon one of their own. But because they allowed it to get so bad, Benjamin wasn't the only tribe that was evil in this day. All the tribes had their problems, so God didn't give them the Benjamites immediately. There was a lot of death and a lot of suffering that happened on both sides because of the wickedness of Benjamin. And things got very nasty. The book ends with the Benjamites being told that they can't marry anybody. But if the Gibeonite men, the ones who are left alive, if they can't marry, what's going to happen? The tribe's going to die. So they have to go and they have to essentially kidnap other people to bring them in as wives for the Benjamites. Horrid stuff because of their sins. And I like how Samuel finishes in the book. He summarizes the entire story. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so next week, we are going to get into the book of Ruth. That'll hopefully be a shorter lesson. I know tonight was long, but a lot of good stuff, a lot of valuable stuff in the book of Judges, a lot of warnings for us. So any comments, questions, concerns before we come to a close? All right.
It makes me think about our hostage.